I was traveling to Louisiana. Anybody here ever been to Louisiana? Okay, a lot of you. I had never been to Louisiana, but I was going to go to preach a series of revival services at a small rural church just outside of Alexandria. So not only was I in Louisiana, this wasn't like New Orleans, or this was a small rural church outside of Alexandria in Louisiana. And I learned a lot about the culture of the Deep South, okay? It is different than the Midwest. Definitely different than Canada. I mean, it's sort of like the opposite. And along the way, I learned a lot of things. I learned that they cook some of the best catfish and cheesecake and jambalaya and gumbo and all that stuff. I ate a lot when I was in Louisiana. Everybody was trying to feed me. Skinny white kid, down in Louisiana. Boy, we need to fatten you up, is that kind of thing. So I had a great time down there and learned a lot. I learned that they have parishes instead of counties in Louisiana. I learned that on the first day of squirrel hunting season, they actually cancel school. Did you know that? They cancel school and they hunt squirrels. And squirrels down there are different than they are here. They're gray, they got huge tails. They look like little dogs running around. And so they kill these things and they eat them. They do eat them. I won't go into the details, but I had a dinner event where they actually had a squirrel's head in a prominent place on the table. So that was a little bit of what I learned about Louisiana. But I also learned that in the Deep South, and specifically at least in that area, relationships run very deep, as in generations upon generations. And what I learned in the process of talking with the pastor and some of the other people is that if you offended my great-great-great-grandpa, then you and I aren't friends. They don't let things go very easily. The divisions run deep. As I was thinking about that experience, and I was thinking about where our country is right now, and thinking about even where we're at, I think the same could be said of all of the United States, and maybe even North America, that we oftentimes see people through a lens of competition and division, ethnically, generationally, certainly politically, especially now. I was just telling somebody this morning, I think I'm going to go on a Facebook fast, at least till the election is over, because it gets under our skin. Our society is set up where conflict continues to be created because it's a competitive system. It's not a collaborative system. It's a competitive one. They say that time heals all wounds, right? Time heals all wounds. That is so false. All that time does is it makes the wounds fester and it makes them go deeper. And oftentimes what time does, and sort of like this rock, the longer you hold on to a wound and the longer I hold on to this rock, the heavier it starts to get and the more tense my arm, and it becomes a distraction. And if I'm not careful with this rock and I don't learn how to set it down, eventually not only is it going to annoy me as I preach this sermon, but it will start to define me. And as I carry this rock outside of the worship center and I begin to drive and go home and go through my week, if I carry this thing around, you know what? All of a sudden people go, who is the guy with the rock? What is wrong with him? It starts to define who I am. Now, this rock represents unforgiveness. This rock represents bitterness. It represents an offense that oftentimes we take and we don't know how to let go of. We don't know how to get rid of it. And today, Jesus is going to share a story. It's a parable of how we're supposed to deal with other people, especially when it comes to the critical issue of forgiveness. And my prayer today is that you would learn by the end of the morning how to take this heavy rock that you've picked up. I don't know where. Some are bigger than others. Some rocks are pretty large. Abuse and hurt, unfaithfulness. Some rocks are pretty big. Some are small. Some are the kind you get in the, you walk in the playground and the little rock gets in your shoe and it just kind of bothers you and annoys you. Some are a little smaller than that. But you need to learn today how to take this rock. I'm even getting out of breath. I am very weak, to be honest with you. And just finally set it down and move on with your life. You don't need to carry that anymore. So turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to start with verse 21. We're in a series called True Story. We're talking about the parables of Christ. I've just said, hey, here's the top 10 list as I see it, so let me just march down and hit all 10 of them. This is number 4. And this is the story of the unmerciful servant, and it starts out with a guy by the name of Peter trying to be a teacher's pet. You guys all know people like that, teacher's pets. Maybe you're one of them, all right? Hey, what do I need to do to get an A++? You know, and the teacher, oh, you're such a good student, right? So Peter comes to Jesus, and he says to him, essentially, and remember, this is a fisherman, burly guy. He's trying to prove himself. You know, he's growing spiritually. He says, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Wait a minute, I know. Up to 7 times? Jesus is like, no. You know, up to 7 times? Now, why would he say 7 times? Well, in rabbinical tradition, you would forgive your neighbor up to 3 times. The rabbis, the Pharisees, others had a lot of strict interpretations on the moral limitations, right? So morality went this far, and then there were always limits. This was never based on grace. It was always based on the law. So the first time someone would say, I'm sorry, the rabbis taught you would forgive them. It's okay. Hey, we all make mistakes. That's fine. You're forgiven. Second time, your neighbor says, hey, remember that thing I did? I did it again. I'm sorry. Second time, okay, but you're pushing your luck. I'm going to forgive you this time. You got one more shot. And the third time, remember that thing I did? Sorry, did it again. Okay, but this is the last time that I'm going to forgive you. After that, no more forgiveness. We're done. Relationship ends. Peter says, up to 7 times? Not 3. Not even 3 times 2, 7 times. That's a nice holy number. Do you like that, Jesus? And Jesus looks at Peter and he says, no, I think you've missed the point. See, you're trying to put limits. Even though you said 7, you're still trying to put limits on forgiveness. Yes, it sounds good, but after the 7th time, you act like you're done. There are no limits to forgiveness. And so Jesus says to him, I tell you, Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times, or as some translations have it, 70 times 7, 490, or a lot. So when somebody offends you in a major way, there is no limit to the offense. And when someone offends you multiple times, time and time again, there is no limit to the number of offenses that you take. 490, 77, 70 times 7, a lot. Then Jesus explains himself, because the disciples at this point are probably looking at him a little bit like, you're crazy. What are you talking about when you say 77 times? And Jesus says in 18:23, this is the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees and begged him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Amazing story. The key phrase there is that he canceled the debt. He canceled the debt. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen 10,000 bags of gold laying around in my lifetime. What would that be? Like, I would imagine if you had 10,000 bags of gold in this room, that would pretty much fill the room at least so high, maybe a foot high with gold. But what is that? Well, in the Greek, 10,000 basically said 10,000 talents. And a talent is the equivalent of about 20 years' wages. So if you figure an average income of 40, 50,000, 20 years, one talent is about $1 million. This guy owes him 10,000 talents. To multiply that up and everything else, that's 200,000 years of labor, or $10 billion. This guy owes him $10 billion. Now, okay, government, we can get up into $10 billion range and $1 trillion range and all that. But a person, one person, owes $10 billion? And immediately where my mind goes is this guy wasn't just bad with his money. This guy was corrupt. This guy was crooked. This guy had placed his family in jeopardy on the backs of whatever he was trying to do, because you don't just rack up $10 billion in cell phone bills. You hear what I'm saying? This is a big deal. This isn't just a money thing. This is a character thing. This is who he is. He's a schemer. He's crooked in some way. And so for the master to say, hey man, $10 billion, I'm going to have to take all of your possessions, and you're going to have to be enslaved for the debt, and the same goes for your wife and children. That's not cruel and unusual punishment. All right, this king is not a cruel and unusually punishing kind of guy. He says, do that. Servant falls on his knees, be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. Yeah, right. $10 billion. You're going to pay that back? How are you going to do that? It's not going to happen. You can't pay it back. That's the point. And so as this servant begins this dialogue with the master, the king, an unexpected twist takes place. As his wife and his children begin to get taken away by the king's workers, and as the man is on his knees, and an unexpected thing takes place, and all of a sudden the king, looking at this man, says, I have pity on you. Something about you has changed. I see something in you that's different. Repentance, a different change of attitude. I don't know what the king saw, but the king saw something in the man that wasn't there before, and he decides to cancel the debt and let him go. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the king is God, and that you are that man, that woman who owes the $10 billion, and that God has forgiven you of a debt you could never pay on your own. As a follower of Christ, if you have repented to God and you have surrendered your life to Him, God looks at you and He forgives the $10 billion. He has pity on you. He loves you. He's gracious, compassionate. And He gives you your life back. And all the things you did in your past, all the stuff that you carried around with you, all the stupid choices, all the bad issues, all the times when you betrayed a friend, all the times when you fell into an addiction, all of the times when you did things that you're not proud of, and mishandled your money, and treated your spouse wrong, or had an affair, or did something against the law, all of those God forgives you of. And you can set that rock down. You don't have to carry it anymore. I don't know if you know what it's like to be forgiven by God of the $10 billion. But as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, I have had to, over the years, come to that realization even more and more. As one who grew up in the church, I wasn't deep into drugs and, capping people and gangbanging and doing all this stuff when I was 5 years old. Okay, that just wasn't me. I grew up in the church. What I've had to learn as a Christian is the depths of my depravity before Christ gave me my life back, and that's been a process. And what's happened is I have had to continually understand this parable and continually realize that I continue to hold on to these rocks that God has forgiven me of. I need to learn to receive God's forgiveness. God has forgiven me but I haven't forgiven myself. And so I've held on to this thing that God wants to take from me. And the first part of this parable is understanding the forgiveness and grace of God and receiving His forgiveness and setting this stuff down and walking free and holy without guilt and shame. A new creation, the old has gone, the new has come. Realizing that. I heard a story of a Filipino priest, a much-loved man of God, who was struggling with a past sin in his life that he committed in seminary. And he found out that within his parish was a woman who supposedly had dreams and visions of Christ. And so he asked this woman, the next time you have a dream or vision of Christ, trying to test her, would you ask him what your priest's sin was that he committed in seminary? Would you just ask him? She said, well, I will. We'll see what happens. So the priest went away one way, the woman went another. They came back together a few days later. The priest said, hey, did you have another vision of Christ? You said, yes, I did. The priest said, well, did Christ visit you? And if so, what did he say about that sin I committed in seminary? Did you ask him about it? Yes, she said. Well, what did he say? She paused for a moment. She looked at him. She said, he said, I don't remember. I don't remember. I don't remember what that sin was you committed in seminary. I don't remember the rock that you keep carrying around. Jeremiah 31:34 says, for I will forgive, God talking here, their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. So I want you to know, before we get into the main part of this passage, you need to understand that God has forgiven you of $10 billion. God has forgiven you of every sin you can imagine. Do not keep carrying around the shame of your past. Do not keep carrying around the sins that God has already forgotten and hasn't even remembered and doesn't remember. You got to set that down in order to live free. Okay? That's the first part. Receive forgiveness. What's interesting to me is that Jesus tended to spend time when he walked this planet around people that needed to hear that first message. He came for the sick, not the healthy. He was called a glutton and a drunkard because he hung out with sinful people. And he showed prostitutes and demon-possessed men, and he showed others what it's like to be able to experience forgiveness and love and compassion that they never felt before, and people's lives were changed. So you need to know how to receive forgiveness. But the first part of the parable actually lays a foundation for the second. This is where it becomes important. So check it out. Let's read verse 28. But when the servant went out, he found, remember, this is the servant that just has been forgiven $10 billion. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him. This scene looks very familiar, doesn't it? Be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison till he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged. Absolutely. And went and told their master everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all of that debt of yours because you begged me to. And here's the moral of the story. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? Yes. 100 silver coins, it's about $3,000. $3,000 is a lot of money. If I had somebody that owed me $3,000, I would probably be asking them to pay up, right? It's a decent amount of money. Unless you've been forgiven of $10 billion. Now all of a sudden, it doesn't mean much at all. It's pretty petty. It's not even one talent. It's not even a quarter of a talent, let alone 10,000 talents. all of a sudden 3,000 isn't that much. As a parent, I've had the experience of giving one of my children a toy, an item, an object, a $10 bill, a $20 bill, something, only to have another child complain, and then to the child that I just gave the amount of money, the toy, the $10 bill, I will say, hey, will you give your sister $1 of the 20 that I just gave you? Do you know? And I love you girls very much. I love you. Claire, you busted me last week for something I said. But other than that, I love you guys a lot. But as a parent, can I tell you how that makes me feel when I go overboard for one, and then I say, will you just share a little bit of what you have to the other, and they don't want to do it, and they throw a fit? You know what that makes me want to do? Exactly. Take it all away from the first one. Because you're not grateful and you don't understand what I've done for you. You need to learn how to give or forgive your sister. In a much bigger way, that is sort of the premise of this parable, is you have been forgiven so much, and now you have this issue, 100 silver coins, $3,000 is nothing, and you're not going to forgive that person. That is hypocrisy at its highest. Colossians 3:13 summarizes it so well. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. In fact, can we just read this together as a church? Let's read it. Here we go. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. That's why you forgive. That's why you forgive. But you don't understand, John. You don't understand what this rock was. You don't understand what they did to me. You don't understand how deep that cut me when they did that. And now you just want me to forgive them? You just want me to wipe my hands of it? No. No. I'm holding on to this. I'm not letting it go. And I'm here to tell you, you hold on to that then. And you don't let it go. And you let it weigh you down, and you let it define you and become who you are. And you carry that around the rest of your life while that other person is off and forgotten about you, doing their own thing in their own way. And you keep hanging on to this thing. And God says, why won't you just forgive them? Why won't you just set it down? I forgave you of so much more. Release that person. Set that rock down. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. It's not even about you and them. It's not even about you and them. It's about you and Him. When you forgive another person, honestly, guys, it's not even about you and them initially. Initially, it's about you and God. Reconciliation, another level. That's a different sermon. That's a different story to be reconciled to that person. I'm just saying you got to forgive them first. And that's between you and God. And you have to set the rock down and move on with your life. Because 9 times out of 10, they've already moved on with theirs. And you're just carrying it. It's hurting you. And it's hurting your walk with Him. So how do you do this? Yes, John, I understand what you're trying to say. Yes, I know I've been forgiven of a lot. But just practically speaking, how do I learn to let go of those rocks? I'm going to give you just 3 things in closing, real quick, principles. The challenge with this parable is the fact that Jesus tells us what not to do, but He doesn't tell us what to do. Okay, don't be like the guy who doesn't forgive. But then how do I actually forgive? Well, let me give you a few principles from Scripture on this issue. Number 1, first thing you got to do is just admit that you're holding on to something. Now, that seems obvious. But in every 12-step program I've ever been a part of, as a Celebrate Recovery leader, AA, NA, all the rest, step number 1, we admitted we were powerless over addictions and compulsive behaviors, that our lives had become unmanageable. The first thing you've got to do is admit you have a problem in everything. And the first thing as a believer that struggles and wrestles with unforgiveness, you've got to admit that I am carrying something, because sometimes these things become a part of us and we don't even realize we're carrying them. Reveal your hurt. Can you just admit that you got burned and stop trying to be a strong man or a strong woman about it and say, you know, that actually hurt me. When that person said that, that bothered me. I've been carrying that around. When my mother-in-law told me that, that frustrated me. When that Facebook post was issued and I knew I was a recipient of it, that bothered me. And you carry that little rock. You got to reveal your hurt first. Just admit you have a problem. Take inventory. Again, in the recovery community, when they're trying to get free of addiction and that kind of thing, one of the things they do is they make a list of all the people they need to make amends to, they need to apologize to. And then they make a second list of all the people that have offended them that they need to release back to God. You've got to reveal your hurt. And even right now, I would encourage you, even right now, what is the rock that you're carrying? Who is the person that's offended you? What are you holding on to in your life? Number 2, release the offender. I just said it a few minutes ago, but it is not about you and them right now. Right now, what you need to do is you need to release that person into the hands of God. God's the only judge. Only God will judge that person. You don't stand in judgment over them, so you have to release that person into the care of God. This isn't about reconciliation right now. This is about forgiveness. You've just got to forgive them and let it go and release the offender into the care of God. Because you don't have to deal or be the judge with anything they did to you. That's not your job. This is really hard. Sometimes we think that if we hold on to it, we have some kind of power over the other person. I don't know why the enemy's tricked us into thinking that. When in reality, all you have is weakness because it bothers you every time you lay in bed at night. Release the offender. Finally, the third thing is remember God's mercy in your life. Can I tell you something about release the offender, by the way? It just popped into my head. You may have to do this more than once. I mean, you may have a moment where you have an experience with God or a time in worship, or you talk to somebody like, you know what, you're right, I got to let that go. I got to let my dad go for what he did to me, or let my mom go for what she said about me, or I've got to let that person go for all the bad things they've been doing behind my back. And then you might have to do it again, and then when that feeling comes, do it again, and then when you hold on to that bitterness, do it again, and continue to release that person until finally they can speak their name or show up at your front porch or knock on your door or call you on the phone, and you don't have that feeling anymore. You don't have that sense of bitterness because you've released them to God. I've had to do this with a number of people. I won't say it because I'm getting pre-recorded right now. But otherwise, I would just make a pact with you and share you the list of the people I have had to do this with. Friends, family, and all the rest. But remember God's mercy. That's number 3. Remember God's mercy. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Remember God's mercy. In a minute, we're going to have some time, the Lord's Supper. This represents the body and blood of Christ. And if you've grown up in the church, you've heard this 1,000 times. I pray it never grows old. That God, who is a pure and spotless Lamb, Jesus Christ, the pure and spotless Lamb, came to planet Earth, humbled himself. We owed God $10 billion, probably a lot more than that. We owed him our very life. And rather than demanding payment for us, in God's great mercy, he sent his Son, his only Son, Jesus Christ. God so loved the world that he sent his Son to die on a cross, to be brutally crucified and murdered, to be flogged and beaten, all because he had compassion on you and loves you so much. And if we ever forget the great and incredible mercy of God, as we start to slip out of that, as we start to lose our focus and we don't remember God's mercy to us becomes a lot easier to begin to demand people that owe us 100 pieces of silver to pay it back. It starts to get a lot easier to demand of other people what they owe us instead of living and walking in forgiveness. The most gracious and amazing, incredible, compassionate people I know are those that have such a deep understanding of what God has done for them, such a deep understanding of God's mercy for them, that they just exude grace to everyone around them. You know people like that. I want you to become someone like that. I want you to become someone like that. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. When I was in Louisiana, we drove all around the state. I went to LSU University, pretty amazing place. There's live oak trees that come right down to the ground. There's this nice kind of lake outside of the football stadium. I mean, it's a beautiful university. We went to LSU, went to some other places. I started talking with the pastor about a little bit more about the history of the church. Come to find out the church he had been pastoring had a whole history of division. Church would be going well and then split, division, over and over again. And so we came to the last night of the revival services on Friday night. And I remember I sort of flipped the script a little bit, and I decided I'm going to talk about forgiveness because there's some deep stuff here in this church, and I'm not sure why it's so deep, but man, it seems deep. It's a stone that they're carrying around. And I told a story about a famous author by the name of John Grisham. You probably read some of his books. He graduated from Mississippi State, a pretty prolific author. And he tells a story in one of his books. I want to read it for you. He said that he had a friend that was found to be terminally ill, and the author asked him, "What do you do when you realize you're about to die?" The friend replied, "It's real simple. You get things right with God. You spend as much time with those you love as you can, and then you settle up with everyone else." I've heard it said this way: if you're going to die soon, and you only had one phone call you could make, who would you call and what would you say? If you were to die tonight and you had one phone call to make, who would you call and what would you say? And why are you waiting? Why are you waiting? Why are you waiting to make peace with that person that you know you need to make peace with? Why are you waiting for the perfect moment and the perfect opportunity where all the stars align and everything's perfect for you to make amends with that person? Why are you waiting for that? Maybe today's the day you need to release them to God, forgive them in your heart, and remember His mercy. So I'm going to invite Elizabeth to